Welcome everybody to another episode of Voices of Influence. Today we're going to be talking about building brand with video content. And to talk about this with us, we have Andrew. Andrew Parker is with us. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Arjun. Great to be with you. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much. So, Andrew, I just want to kickstart this by asking you about your journey into the world of marketing. Tell me a little bit more about what got you here.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually went to school to be a musician.
Okay.
I got my degree, my bachelor's degree in music, and so that was the goal. I've sung my whole life, but one of the things that I've realized being a musician was that it's hard to raise a family and have a life that is a little bit more stable, which is kind of what I was hopeful for. So I really needed something to kind of get me to scratch that creative itch, but also be able to provide a good living. And so that's kind of how I got into marketing. My my degree is in music, but I took a lot of classes in music business specifically, so in the promotion of music and commercial music for film and radio and TV. And so that kind of ignited a sense of like, oh, I could go and do this for a little while. Um, and so I actually got a job while I was still in college at a marketing agency here in Salt Lake City, where I'm from, and the agency needed somebody to kind of come in and figure out all the newfangled digital marketing stuff. So this was right at the turn of the 2000s there. I remember my boss basically coming to me and saying, "Hey, we hear that email marketing is big. Can you figure it out?" And so I'm like, yeah, sure, we can do that. So that's kind of where I cut my teeth, was in email marketing. And after I did that for a couple of years, I went in and started learning a lot about paid ads. So with Google and then eventually Facebook and social media. And then throughout my career, I've kind of just built on those skill sets, right? So um, uh, started leveraging video pretty heavily. Actually, when I about 10 years ago or so is when I really started to get into that. And ever since then, I've been trying to basically pull all the different things together. So email, paid ads, videos, podcasts, blog posts, trying to make it all into a cohesive customer experience. So that's been kind of my journey into marketing.
I love it. Um, I want to ask. I mean, I know that you have a long history in marketing, and especially like if you started off with digital marketing, and like you've moved on to like several of these things. I mean, like in fact, like you're doing many of these things right now. Um, I want to talk about video, but like maybe even broader. Just like tell me a little bit more about like the inbound versus like the outbound, as they call it, like the content marketing itself. How much has that changed in the recent past, especially with like AI and everything? Is the outbound marketing still like a big focus versus inbound marketing? What kind of companies choose what? Give us a little bit more about like what kind of companies should focus a lot more on inbound marketing, content based.
Yeah, it's such a good question. As you know, like marketing changes basically every hour, these days, right? And AI has, kind of made that turn that into basically every minute or two. Um, so it's hard to kind of keep up and figure out, what works for you. One of the things when it comes to content, the thing that I've seen see be really helpful is it's helpful for all brands, but especially for brands just starting out, smaller brands, even companies that just have a couple of employees. You got a really good idea. Content's a great way to just kind of get out there and sell your idea, because in a lot of cases, that's the thing that matters the most, is that you have to get people on board with the idea of what it is that you're doing. And if you've got a really complicated product, which a lot of people do these days, because the world has gotten a lot more complex, video becomes a great way to do that, because you can very easily and very succinctly not just tell people about the product, but the power of videos that you get to show them how it works, right? And so when we're thinking about like how things have changed over time, when I first got started in email marketing, everything was text based, and like including an image, for example, in an email marketing was heresy. It's like, well, you shouldn't do that. That it'll blocked by the spam filters and it'll never get through, and all those kinds of things. And now, video actually becomes a really big part of email marketing. Some of the more
Mm,
some of the more innovative things I've seen are people creating videos specifically for email outreach. So if you've got a webinar, for example, instead of
right.
doing a big text-based invitation with bullet points about best practices and what you're going to learn and all that other good stuff, you send them a link to a minute and a half video that's exciting, that has the presenter talking a little bit about it, and those tend to get a little bit better and more interesting play. So it's one of those things where it used to be like everything had to be very very controlled, maybe 20
Mm,
years ago, about how marketing works. And today it's just like, nah, man, just get whatever you can get out there as often as you can get out there,
right.
in wherever you can. And so I think that makes a big difference.
I like what you're saying right now is it's become pretty normal for people to send video via email or links to video via email and everything. Is this generally like a reflection on like people's consumption and like their attention spans, or like what is the big reason why there's been like a big uptake of video? And I think we've seen that big uptake, but like what do you think is like the underlying reason?
It's a really good question. I think for me, and what, at least in my experience, the reason video has been such a great channel for folks is that it's become a lot easier to create video.
Mm,
So because it's become a lot easier to create video, there's just more out there.
mm,
And and you and I both know, like, as we kind of run our businesses and run and been in the business world for a long time, the amount of time that you have to sit down and read a list or a huge article about how things are supposed to work it's very minimal. I still do it because there's certain topics that I kind of want to do a deep dive on. But video really sits at that top of the funnel, right? It gets you a chance to get people really interested really fast. And if you're smart about it, and I'm not always, so like, take this for what it's worth. But if you're smart about it, video, when it sits at the top of the funnel, can be really effective at driving people into those middle of the funnel campaigns. Uh,
mm.
and so that becomes where you start to see a lot of the conversion really happen. And if you've started them off with video, I think it's actually a little bit of an accelerant, because you don't have to continue to explain what it is you do and why you do it and how you do it. People are like, oh yeah, I remember watching that video.
Right. Yeah. So it's a good point, like about it being more sticky, it being like compacting a lot of information in a smaller amount of time, and like people who are more visual are able to like get that, and that's really valuable in that's a way as well. I want to focus on like one specific types of video, which is more like the talking head video where people come in, it's like and having conversations about that. Tell me a bit more about those style videos, especially when it comes from like founder of an organization, and like we're talking about like early stage companies or even like mid stage companies. Um, is this something that we're seeing it take off? Like there's so many people doing it. Tell me a little bit more about that as a strategy.
You know, I kind of subscribe to the idea that people don't buy products; they buy people, right? They
Right.
buy relationships, right? Like, and I think we all subscribe to that in some fashion or another. But those videos where you kind of get to meet the founder and you get to feel their passion, their experience, you get to learn from them. I think that makes a huge difference. It's used to be in the early days of digital marketing, you really had to work hard with the copy to make it sound very normal, sound very authentic, very real, very human. And that's actually a skill, right?
Yeah.
That is, that's refined over time. So it becomes, only a few people could do it. Nowadays with video, even if somebody's not a great writer or a great
Right.
designer, or doesn't have a great way to present themselves necessarily, they can get on and you can hear them talk, and you can hear and feel their passion through the screen. And so, talking head videos are one of those things where, as long as the person talking has a lot of passion about it and you can feel it and it doesn't come across as fake or inauthentic, because we've all seen those kinds of videos too, right?
Right.
Then they can be really helpful and really useful. So it's just a matter of making sure that when you get on screen, you don't worry so much about the camera. You just tell people the story.
Right. Yeah. And I think like, this is really fascinating for me in that like how this has come a big like big leaps right now with like leaders being these people who are behind the screens that you hardly hear from them to now being so much more visible. And in that sense, they're using this as a channel, as you rightly mentioned, is like people buy from people, like the trust that you have to build for these people, and you need to come across authentically. So one question on this is this something that's only true with like the modern crop of people, in that like, it's like, oh, there are like these 20 something entrepreneurs who are like doing this, or is this starting to like percolate in like mid-size organizations where even some of the more experienced leaders are seeing this as a way to be visible to their audience?
Yeah, 100%. They're definitely seeing it as a way to be visible to their audience. I'll tell you, most subject matter experts that I have ever worked with in marketing to try and kind of get their message out, they'll often send me videos and be like, "We should do this kind of video, and it should be really cool." And I'll be like, "Cool, we should do that." And so we get everything ready to go, and then they get to the camera part and they get to the recording part, and they just like they freeze up a little bit, right? Um,
Mm,
and that's normal, I think, because when the camera's on you and you haven't done it a lot, right? The camera kind of affords you, or it feels like it's a formal piece of equipment. Like, well, if I'm on camera, I've got to make sure that my shirt's right, my tie's good, or my jacket's good, my hair looks good, all that good stuff, and that's important, right? You don't want to have distractions, but they over formalize things quite a bit.
mm,
So the way to kind of get around that, or one of the things I'd like to do in order to kind of get around that, is I get them to practice doing
mhm,
videos, but to do them with internal communications.
mm,
So there's still stakes there, right? So because if the subject matter expert or the CEO or the leader or whatever it is happens to be, there's still stakes in those mid-sized companies that they've got to show up, they've got to make sure that they look good, they've got to speak articulately. But there's also a little bit of safety there, knowing that if they screw up a little bit, there's a
right.
little bit of forgiveness. Assuming, of course, again, that the CEO has a good relationship with the organization. So it gives them a chance to kind of get practiced at being in front of the camera and recognizing that the camera doesn't necessarily make things more formal. It's just there to translate what you are, right? And
Right.
so as you get more comfortable in front of the camera and doing that internally, I think that makes a big difference for what you end up doing externally. And it's good for the marketing people too, because then you can start to test and say, well, what kind of things do we want to do differently? Do we want to do from this angle? Do we want to move the camera? Do we want to do this kind of B-roll? Do we want to do, do we want to put them in a different kind of setting? Do we want to change a few things? There's lots of different things that you can do. So I think it's a lot of really good practice to build that trust and authenticity, largely through doing some reps with internal communications.
I really love that tip. It almost seems like it's a like you're practicing, or like having like a safe environment where you are like just presenting yourself, and like it's good thing. And you mentioned one thing very important, which is that like there's the leaders, and then there are like the marketing team that's also like sort of driving this video messaging content and everything. So I mean, talk to me a little bit more about like all these different people over here, right? Like, so one idea is like overcoming hesitations, you're like trying to do it internally, but you need to build a culture of this across the organization. So it's like you need to get buy-in from like the leaders, and then there's the marketing people involved, and then you're using resources like editing, and like you're probably spending some time and money on these things. And so tell me a little bit more about like how an early stage organization or a marketer could like get that company-wide buy-in on this as a strategy.
So let me tell you a story about that, because maybe this will be
Yeah,
helpful.
that'd be
Um,
awesome.
so years ago, I used to work for a company that did tech support for senior citizens. So
Mm,
you'd if you were not very technologically savvy, or if it was kind of outside your wheelhouse, which is totally fine, you'd sign up for a subscription model with our company that would allow you to call in and talk to somebody who was technologically savvy and say, my computer doesn't work and I don't know why. And so
mm,
And so, we built that business largely through Google Ads. And so we run ads constantly and get leads in for people who needed help with this, that, or the other technology problem, and then we'd help them with that, and then encourage them to sign up for the subscription in case they had other problems. But the 99% of all leads that we were getting for that company were coming through, I want to say maybe 10 or 15 Google campaigns, and that was it, right? And one day I walked into work, and the entire sales floor, because we had a couple hundred folks on the sales floor, the entire sales floor was quiet, which was like nerve-wracking. Yeah, exactly. What's going on? And they told me, they were like, we don't have any leads. I'm like, wait, what? Why? What happened? Well, this is what happens. Google switches the algorithm overnight, right? And all of a sudden, the spigot is off. And so, we spent 2-3 weeks trying to get that spigot turned back on, and we finally ended up doing that. But one of the things that came out of that was we needed a much more robust diversification strategy. And so one of the things I always tell people about video is I'm like, look, it can be a supremely good diversification strategy for your lead gen. And so if you're talking to founders as a marketing person, you want to say, look, we do really well. Most small businesses start off doing really well with social media, or they do really well with email. Video is one of those things that doesn't always come right at the beginning. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always, right? So I say, if you want to really diversify your lead flow, your lead gen, your customer acquisition, video is a great way to start doing that. And that usually gets a lot of buy-in. And then the other thing to mention about that same company. So after we had that issue, I got them to buy in on doing a thing where I said, look, why don't we show our customers on YouTube so that they could see themselves on YouTube? Right. There was a lot of content in those days for folks that were a little bit older. And so we put together, I hired a screenwriter, basically, had write me a 10 episode YouTube series with an older person that was one shot. I said, you have one camera, you just have to be able to hit record, and that's all you can do. So I want you to just write something for this person to say for a couple of minutes. And we created a series called I, Jane. And it ended up being really successful. And because she would get on and she'd talk about some of her technology problems, but she was this charming actress who just had, who you could see as your kind of grandma, trying to struggle with the phone and stuff. And we told that story, but made it feel like the individual, like the customer was there and they were watching themselves. And they're like, oh yeah, I relate to this person. And so that was the other kind of selling point that I made, was like, we can diversify, and then we can also show our target audience that we understand them. And that made a huge difference.
I like that. I think the 2 points that you mentioned, I wanted to reiterate that is, one is like you present video as a way to diversify when it compared to all the other types of lead generation mechanisms. And the second thing is like using a sample, and that actually like tells people that like how they would be able to relate to the audience persona by using video. It's like very, very, you can connect to it in a better level. I really like this. And I think like you mentioned a couple of things around like, YouTube and everything else as well. Tell me a bit more about when it comes to distribution of video. There's one where like you're sending it through email and everything. Like distribution of video is a big part in itself. So there's social media, which is like where mostly this is getting distributed. How should a company think about their video distribution, which channels to choose, and like what formats and everything?
Yeah, such a great question. And, it's a question I think that people pay like cursory attention to. They're like, oh yeah, we'll just make a YouTube video and stick it there.
Right.
And you have to think about it a little bit. The number one thing to think about, obviously, there is target audience. Like, who's your target audience and where are they, right? If they're, if they tend to be a little bit middle-aged or older, they're likely on Facebook and YouTube. The millennials are on Instagram, and my kids are on TikTok, right? So, you got to figure out where your audience lies. But I think the temptation is often to say, well, we created this video asset and we created something that took a lot of time, money, and effort. We got to distribute it into every single channel that there is.
Right.
And of course, you can't do that, right?
Mm.
Then you bifurcate your audience. And also, sometimes the content that you have is not necessarily going to be relevant for certain audiences. So for me, one of the things I always do is I say, okay, well, where is my audience? And then I pick that particular channel, and that's the one I hit, and that's where everything goes. And if it ends up on other channels because somebody ripped it or downloaded it or something like that, then fine, whatever. But I always pick one channel and go full bore on that one, and that makes, I think, a lot of difference in terms of distribution. And you get really good at the targeting too if you want to do some paid ads along with that.
That makes sense. Actually, that's actually an interesting viewpoint because yes, redistribution is the name of the game these days. Then like people are trying to like redistribute it, but you somewhat sacrifice a little bit of that targeting of like the demographics that you picked early on. It's a good
Yeah.
point. Um, Jumping gears here and then like talk about what is a good content creation process that you have done in the past. When I say talk about process, everything from like how frequently do you create content to how frequently do you distribute it to what is the steps involved, people involved. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Have you got a couple hours on this? Uh, there's a lot of different ways to kind of to skin this cat. But I think the thing that there's a couple principles, I guess I would say, that kind of guide my thinking on process. The first principle is to just be deliberate about your cadence, meaning
Mhm.
it doesn't matter if you want to publish every day, every week, every month. Just be deliberate about it, right? So choose what's important to you, what you think you can do, what your resources are, all those other kinds of things. But make sure you're deliberate. And then as an add-on to that, make sure that you're consistent. So if you choose to do something every week, do something every week, right?
Mm.
And because that consistency is what really builds people's affinity for your brand. And honestly, it gives you a chance to have more affinity, more touch points with people. And you set an expectation with people that says, I'm going to come out once a week with new content, or once a month, or whatever it is that you feel like you want to get to. So I think that's probably one of the most important things to do, is just be deliberate about what you want to do and how consistent you want to do it. And then as far as the process goes, one of my principles is that creativity has to run on a track.
Mm.
If you're a creative person, it's really easy to start just going off into all sorts of different things and like, oh, this is really cool, and oh, this is really cool. And most of the creative people that I've ever worked with, myself included, tend to get a little distracted about like the new shiny thing that goes
Shiny red
on.
object. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And so you've got to set some very specific tracks. But what people often do, and I've done this myself, and it's something I've had to learn, is that when you're setting people on creatives on a track, you have to make sure that that track is long enough for them to get to the point where you want them to get to. So
Mm.
if you're going to create videos once a month, make sure you back up a couple of months before that, to give yourself the time, not just to do the filming and the editing and the promotion, but to give yourself time to just, honest to goodness, think about, well, what do I want to say? And you set a deadline for each of those different periods. So I'll often give the creative team and say, okay, well, we have this idea for a campaign or a video. You've got 3 weeks to think about it and come up with an idea. At the end of the 3 weeks, we pick your best idea and we go with it. But for 3 weeks, go off into the woods, take a trip, take a drive, whatever it is you got to do in order to kind of feed that input there. Do that. And that probably leads to the third point, which is that if you're going to do process, part of your process should be to get as much input as possible. Watch stuff, read stuff, go visit stuff.
Mm.
I used to work in a museum, and one of the things I used to do in order to kind of get myself into that creative mindset is I would go and I would walk around the museum and I would read and experience the exhibits that were there. So just giving yourself a chance to get that input in there will then start on the track to be able to create something cool.
I love it. I think these are great points. I feel like, people don't think about these processes, and like the cadence that you mentioned is like super important. I feel like that's one of the key points that like many people don't think about. It's very like, oh, I feel really creative this week, and then I'm just gonna like do something, and then like 2 months later, I'm like, oh, I did something really cool then, and like now I don't feel as good, so I'm not gonna be able to do it. So like having
Totally.
that cadence is actually like a really good idea. Awesome. We are almost towards the end of it, and I want to like ask one last question over here about like um, specifically around like early stage companies that are starting to do more founder brand building, and they want their founders to be the brand for their organizations. What would be your tips for them to get started and to stay on course?
Yeah, a great question. The best thing I always tell folks there is just start. It doesn't matter, right? I
Mm,
think a lot of people, especially because when you're a founder, you want the founder to be a brand. There's this sense of, well, this is my baby, and I want people to really like it, and so I'm gonna, everything's got to be perfect. Nah, like it's what you got to do is just break out your phone and turn on the camera and just start talking.
right,
One of the things I tell people all the time is to say, pull out your phone, turn on the camera, and just start walking and start talking about things that are important to you. Most founders know their business really well.
right,
And they've had to sell it, right? They've had to sell it to investors, to employees, to their mom, whatever it happens to be, right? Um,
right.
and so just get out, get out, start walking, and act like you're pitching it to a friend of yours. And so that's the best thing to do. I think it's just is really to get started. And then maybe we talked about kind of picking a channel and kind of just doing, picking one channel and kind of going for it. But one of the things that's probably most important, I think, for founders and entrepreneurs to know is that they should have license to get weird with their video,
Mm,
right? So
mm,
I believe in getting weird with your videos, and you can take getting weird whatever way you want to take that, and however that
right,
means to you. But like, get weird with the videos. Like, who cares what happens, right? At the end of the day, um, you're going to attract the people to your business that are most interested in who you are and who
right.
you are authentically. And so get weird, man. Like, it's easier and more fun to create video that's different, that nobody else is doing, and that's unique to you. It doesn't have to look like an interview on 60 Minutes. It can look like, and it doesn't have to look like the latest TikTok trend. It can just look like whatever resonates with you, and you'll get better at it as you go along.
I think this is a new idea that like you said that like nobody has said, but it makes perfect sense. It's like give yourself permission to be weird. I mean, first of all, like weird sells, it sets you apart. Like you're gonna like stand out, but at the same time, it like kind of takes away from the pressure of you being coming there with like a very defined message. It like kind of opens up that creativity for you. It's like kind of one of those improv classes that you go to where they say like do something very quirky, and then your creative juices start flowing after that. So I love that as an idea. In fact, like my ideas are like rolling right now as to like how can we like embody that into product as well. So this has been great. Andrew, appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. The time 25 minutes flew really quickly, and we got some really valid points over here. Thanks so much for being on our show and sharing your ideas with our audience.
You bet. And Arjun, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome.